You must be quite a girl.
Wanna bet?
The American Film Institute called Some Like It Hot the greatest film comedy ever made.
And I thought I was going to split a gut. I was laughing out loud. I fell off the couch at one point.
It's the tale of two musicians on the run from the mob, hiding out in an all-girl band.
Well, here we are.
Are you two from the Polyakov agency?
Yes, we're the new girls.
Brand new.
And when it first hit theaters, audiences weren't ready.
It was the worst reaction of any film I have ever been in.
Coming at the tail end of the conservative 1950s, the movie made a mockery of uptight American attitudes about sex.
What is this, the world's first Hollywood gay romance?
I tell you, I will never find another man who's so good to me.
To get it made, director Billy Wilder had to defy Hollywood's powerful old guard.
If they don't like it, that's too bad for them.
But even more shocking than the movie's premise were the backstage feuds.
Then as he was standing up, he said, "It's like kissing Hitler."
I never said it.
Secret affairs.
She was naughty.
And a blonde bombshell with a more sophisticated strategy than anyone expected.
If you happen to have blonde hair, you're considered dumb. I think it's a very limited view.
This is the story of Some Like It Hot, the comedy that nearly everyone said could never be made.
The film is revolutionary.
And that helped bring the most powerful men in Hollywood to their knees.
Nothing matched our movie. Nothing.
It's the late 1950s, and a man named Billy Wilder has what may be the best idea of his life, or the worst. Billy was a filmmaker known for big, bold films, movies that are today regarded as among the best ever made. He did Double Indemnity, about a woman who seduces a salesman into having an affair so he'll kill her husband. He made The Lost Weekend, which was such a brutal look at alcoholism that a liquor industry trade group reportedly offered Paramount $5 million to burn the film. And Billy Wilder made Sunset Boulevard, about a deranged former star who hatches a deadly plot to regain her fame.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Billy Wilder's movies were colored in part by his unlikely journey to Hollywood, which was as fascinating a story as any of his films. He was born in a tiny village that he later described as half an hour from Vienna by telegraph. As a young man, he worked in jazz clubs of the 20s as what was called a taxi dancer, basically an escort who got a commission from the club for every lonely woman he danced with. He used that money to make movies with his friends, and from his 20s into his 30s, he turned his filmmaking hobby into a career in Berlin. Then, in some particularly smart timing, Billy fled Germany for Hollywood just days after the Reichstag fire. And he quickly became known as one of the most talented writers and directors in the industry. Alfred Hitchcock once said that the two most important words in film are Billy and Wilder. But by the 1950s, Billy was getting frustrated. Since nearly the start of his Hollywood career, he'd been under contract to Paramount. These were the days of what was called the studio system. A handful of powerful studio chiefs controlled the whole industry, and everyone else had to work under strict contracts that dictated their every move. That severely limited the kind of movies that Billy could make. Studio chiefs tended to prioritize whatever they thought would appeal to the broadest audience, which at the time meant white, Christian, and straight. In an article from around this time, Life magazine described Hollywood output as having a $1 million mediocrity that was the very backbone of Hollywood. Working for Paramount, Billy often found the more controversial elements of his films wiped away. For example, in the original book of The Lost Weekend, the main character is gay, but they made Billy straighten that character out. And that overbearing studio system was a problem for Billy, because he wanted his next film to be all about drag. He'd gotten the idea from a Depression-era French movie called Fanfares of Love, about two unemployed musicians who put on a series of disguises in order to get jobs, including, at one point, disguising themselves as women to work in an all-girl band. It was a popular movie. It inspired a 1945 film in Sweden and a 1951 remake in Germany. Billy was a fan, and he bought the rights so he could make an American version. But that was going to be tricky. In Europe at that time, drag was generally seen as harmless fun. But in the US, it was far more taboo. In fact, in many parts of the country, it was a crime. Anything that even hinted at homosexuality was thought to be a sickness, a threat to society, even in relatively liberal Hollywood. Around the same time that Billy was working on this adaptation, a group of activists started what was the first pro-gay publication in the US, a magazine called One, that the US Postal Service confiscated. The government said that One magazine was illegal to mail because it contained a story about two women who fall in love, and the Postmaster General said that was lustfully stimulating to the average homosexual. Meanwhile, a school board outside LA was busy co-producing a film called Boys Beware, which was full of hateful propaganda about gay men.
Ralph was sick. A sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious. You see, Ralph was a homosexual.
Basically, the prevailing belief was that anyone operating outside traditional gender roles was sick, dangerous. They needed to be put away. And an even bigger obstacle for Billy, movies in the 1950s were strictly regulated by a body called the Production Code Administration, also known as the Hays Code, which was ruled over by a man called Jeffrey Sherlock. Sherlock had a bizarre background. He was raised in a spiritual commune in San Diego called Loma Land, which was based on the teachings of a Russian mystic called Madame Blavatsky. Sherlock left the commune in his 20s, and he held various odd jobs. He wrote a play that was never produced, but it got him in the door at Paramount, where he worked his way up to producer, and then jumped over to the MPAA, and later to the Production Code Administration. The PCA was essentially the chief censor for films from the 1930s through the 60s. Every studio submitted scripts and final cuts to the PCA, which rated them on various factors from alcohol use, to depictions of priests, to interracial relationships, and, of course, homosexuality, or what was then called sex perversions. Such depictions were strictly banned, or if they did appear, they had to be punished by the end of the film. Now, there were occasionally depictions of men in women's clothes, but they were usually brief, like in Laurel and Hardy films, which were mostly pre-code anyway.
If I wasn't a perfect lady, I'd bust you in the nose.
Or you might see drag in super low-budget movies produced outside the studio system, like Boy, What a Girl.
Well, I never married because I never found the right woman. But how could you? Who ever heard of anyone marrying a woman? My brother did.
And Glenn or Glenda.
Give this man satin undies, a dress, a sweater, and a skirt, or even the lounging outfit he has on, and he's the happiest individual in the world.
And of course, Cary Grant dressed briefly in drag, twice.
Because I just went gay all of a sudden.
But in general, movies made for wide release never went anywhere near men in women's clothing. And if they did, it was shown only briefly, and is something that the main characters found distasteful. So adapting Fanfares of Love into an American film was a tremendous long shot, a risk no studio would ever want to take. And that's just what executives told him. When Billy pitched his idea to David O. Selznick, who once ran RKO, Selznick told him he was crazy. But then something happened that gave Billy a chance to flip the terms under which he worked. For years, Billy had been under contract to Paramount and its then president, Barney Balaban, the uncle of actor Bob Balaban. But in 1953, Paramount made a huge mistake. That year, Billy made a film for them called Stalag 17, set in a German POW camp during World War II. It was intended to be his commentary on the war and the German government, a very personal story since he had barely escaped the Holocaust and many of his family were killed in the camps. But when the film was dubbed for international release, Paramount didn't want to offend German officials. They told Wilder they were going to add dialogue, changing the film's main villain from a German spy to Polish. Wilder was infuriated and demanded to speak to Balaban. But even after all those years and all those hits that he'd made, he never heard anything back, not even a call. And the film was released with Paramount's changes. Furious, Billy decided he'd never make a picture for them ever again. He left Paramount, never to return. So where did he go? Shockingly, to one of the cheapest outfits in town, a company called Allied Artists, which had a terrible reputation for producing low-budget B-movies like King of the Zombies, Killer Shark, Female Fugitive, and The Human Monster. Why there? Because it was recently under new management. Allied had recently been taken over by three brothers named Walter, Marvin, and Harold Mirisch. Like everyone in this story, the Mirishes had an unusual background. They got their start in showbiz through a company that sold candy at movie theaters. But after a few years, they set their sights a little higher, and they bought a cheap studio with the dream of making pictures of their own. And that meant mounting a challenge to the old studio system. Essentially, a new way of making films, with independent companies. The Mirishes weren't the only indie producers on the rise around this time, but they had something that no one else did. Billy Wilder, one of the most successful directors in the world. And what Billy got out of all this was freedom. With his new partners, he could make whatever he wanted. It was a perfect chance to make a drag comedy, though it had to have been terrifying to the Mirishes that this enterprise depended on a movie about something that could get you arrested.
An awful lot of people, I'm sure, because I was aware of it in the industry at the time, thought he was crazy.
Billy started talking to actors that he thought would be a good fit, starting with Frank Sinatra, who was interested in the part. But when Billy invited Frank Sinatra to lunch to talk about it, Frank stood him up, and that was the end of that. Next, Billy went to an up-and-coming actor named Anthony Perkins. He hadn't yet had his iconic breakout role in Psycho. At this point, Perkins was mostly known as a screen heartthrob under contract at Paramount. But Paramount had a problem, namely that it was fairly well known in the industry that Perkins was dating another movie hunk, Tab Hunter. Obviously, they couldn't have that, so the studio put a lot of work into straightening out his reputation, planting news stories about what a ladies' man Perkins was. Appearing in drag would have been a colossal risk to his career. Plus, he was already committed to appear in a film with Audrey Hepburn, so he had to turn Billy down. But then, someone happened to come along who was, just like Billy, newly independent. Tony Curtis was an interesting choice for a project like this. He was a popular actor who'd been working under contract at Universal since 1948. He'd had some success in Arabian Nights movies like Son of Ali Baba and The Prince Who Was a Thief, but the studio also put him in some more awkward roles, like The Purple Mask, where he appears with Angela Lansbury playing a sort of gay Zorro.
And I'm enrolled in a school in order to study dramatics.
In the early 50s, Tony had married another star, Janet Leigh, and the two started appearing in movies together, which proved popular. So popular, in fact, they realized they might have more clout if they, too, left the studios behind. As a Hollywood power couple, they started their own independent production company called Kirtley. Tony got out of his Universal contract and started making the projects that he wanted to make, like The Sweet Smell of Success, which critics loved, but audiences hated. It lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, jeopardizing Tony and Janet's attempt to get out from under the thumb of the studios. When Billy Wilder and the Mirishes approached Tony about appearing in drag, he was intrigued. Sure, that was a risk, but there was something appealing about the idea.
Well, you know, all of us are half man, half woman. Some of us more than others.
And of course, working with a director as big as Billy Wilder was the chance of a lifetime. And it was a chance to prove that he could make it on his own without a studio controlling his career. Tony said yes, but he knew if this didn't work out, it could torpedo his entire career. With Tony on board, Billy kept hunting for a co-star. And that's when he came across Jack Lemmon, another up-and-coming actor. He was under contract to Columbia, then run by Harry Cohn, one of the most hated men in Hollywood. Harry Cohn was vicious and controlling. He was known for getting violent with actors and for his ties to organized crime. Some of the pictures that Cohn put Jack in were good calls, like It Should Happen to You, made by the gay director George Cukor. But other pictures were flops, like Bell, Book and Candle, a supernatural romance that partially inspired the show Bewitched. It's a fun film, but it was a major flop. Jack could tell he wasn't being given the kind of chances that he deserved. And then he got a lucky break one day in a restaurant. Jack happened to be at dinner with his soon-to-be wife, Felicia.
And a Viennese pixie, he walked over to the table, he sat down, and he says, well, we got these two musicians, they masquerade in women's clothes and they join an all-girl orchestra. Which means if you want to play this part, you're going to be in drag for 90% of the film. You want to do it? And thank God I said yes.
Just like that, Jack Lemmon was cast.
And we got outside, and Felicia immediately said, why did you say yes without a script? And I said, because it's Billy Wilder. He knows that I'm going to play that part. He'll write the part with me in mind.
But he was also aware of how risky this could be, that he might be stuck with a reputation for doing pansy-type roles, which could doom his chances of ever playing a leading man again. But the chance to work with Billy Wilder was too good to pass up. Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon were great actors with some name recognition, but they weren't quite stars, not the kind of celebrity that people would come out in droves to see. Billy knew he needed to find a big name to round out the cast, especially since he was no longer talking to Frank Sinatra. And that's when he got a surprising letter from Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn had worked with Billy before on The 7-Year Itch. That film was a huge, iconic hit, and both Marilyn and Billy called their collaboration one of the worst experiences of their lives. They fought constantly. They vowed they'd never work together again. So you can imagine Billy's shock when Marilyn wrote that she was looking for her next role, and did he possibly have anything that might be good for her? So what was going on? Well, just like Billy, Marilyn was looking for independence. She'd been toiling under contract to Fox, run by Darryl Zanuck, since 1946. Zanuck was another notorious tyrant. He was especially unkind to women. According to one associate, he called actresses studio hookers. In picture after picture, Zanuck forced her to play the dumb blonde. And Marilyn, who was actually quite savvy, wanted more. The breaking point came when Zanuck sent her another script. After her last few pictures were so successful, she expected a rich, complex role. But what she got was a script for a remake of The Girl in Pink Tights. She was going to play a sexy saloon girl, another dumb blonde role, and on top of that, she'd make less than a third of her co-star, Frank Sinatra. Marilyn was furious. She wrote the word trash across the script and sent it back to Zanuck, telling him she wouldn't do it. Fox lawyers sent a reply. She was under contract. She had no choice. But they didn't hear back. That's because Marilyn skipped town. She went on a publicity tour, entertaining soldiers and generally winning over sympathy in her battle with Fox. And then later that year, she made an even bolder move. She flew to New York in disguise under the name Zelda Zonk, and announced the formation of a new company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, which she would use to make the movies that she wanted to make. Zanuck was furious. Fox leaked quotes from studio workers saying that Marilyn was washed up and totally replaceable, and they didn't need her anyway. But they also sued to force her to come back. After a flurry of negotiations, Fox settled. She'd stay under contract, but with a big boost to her salary and control over which pictures she'd do. She might have played dumb blondes, but Marilyn was also a shrewd businesswoman. Despite this win, it was just the first step of taking the reins of her career. Now, she'd actually have to prove that she could make a hit without Zanuck telling her what to do. She made a few movies with mixed results, and before long, it seemed like her acting career might be faltering. And what's worse, money was getting tight, especially since she was supporting her second husband, the playwright Arthur Miller. Marilyn needed a hit, and she knew that as a director, Billy Wilder had gotten one of the best performances of her career. For his part, Billy knew that Marilyn was one of the biggest box office draws in the world, not to mention incredibly talented.
I always thought, that this girl had a great sense for dialogue. She knew where the laughs were. And she had that unique thing that makes a big star a big star. By that I mean, women and men like her equally. There's something so totally disarming about her.
Despite their past differences, they needed each other and decided to give it another go. Privately, Marilyn was reluctant to take the part in Some Like It Hot. She'd be playing a character named Sugar, a role that had some interesting emotional complexity by the end of the story, but for a lot of the picture, Sugar comes off as just another dumb blonde. And there was one more reason to be wary, one that very few people knew about. According to Tony Curtis's memoir, 10 years earlier, he and Marilyn had enjoyed a steamy romance. They'd met on the Universal lot in the early 50s and went on a few dates that got pretty intense. But according to Tony, there was a real risk that if gossip columnists found out about their relationship, they'd try to blackmail one of them to get dirt on the other. So they let the relationship cool and went their separate ways. Now it was 10 years later, they were both married to other people, and being reunited to play characters who fall in love could rekindle things and make filming awfully volatile. For the time being, with the cast coming together, Billy got to work on a script with his writing partner, Izzy Diamond. Wilder and Diamond had a close friendship, strikingly similar to the two main characters that they wrote for Some Like It Hot. A pair who always knows what the other's thinking, who clown around and get into trouble and always have each other's back. It was a friendship that one biographer called a disrespectful intimacy. They started hammering out an American version of the story about two musicians named Jerry and Joe who dress as women to find work in an all-girl band, with a big romantic twist when one of them falls in love with a woman. European audiences had loved the story in its previous incarnations. But Billy and Iz struggled to make the drag angle palatable to a more uptight US audience. And that's when Iz got the brilliant idea of setting it in the past. His thinking was, if everyone's in costume, the drag wouldn't look so jarring to American viewers. And that gave Billy the idea for why the two American men are willing to dress as women. In this version of the story, they'd accidentally witness a mob hit based on the real-life Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. The mobsters would see them and give chase, and the guys would be forced to go into hiding to escape. Wilder and Diamond figured that if the characters' lives were threatened, with a gun literally to their heads, audiences would accept that as a valid reason to do drag. So now the story was starting to take shape. It was a buddy crime comedy set in the 1920s, 30 years earlier. Roughly equivalent to making a movie today set in the 90s. They started typing it up and sent a few pages to their actors.
And then about 60 pages came up to my house one morning. I sat down right there and then with a cup of coffee and read the 60 pages, and I thought I was going to split a gut. I fell off the couch at one point. I really did. I started laughing and rolled over and turned and so forth. The script went all over the room.
But they didn't send a complete script, because it didn't exist.
I said, Billy, is the funniest 60 pages of a script that I've ever read. And he said, well, wonderful. He said, the rest of it we'll finish while we shoot.
Meanwhile, Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon had their work cut out for them, learning how to do drag. Remember, this is the 1950s. Gay bars are underground, drag is illegal in large parts of the country. They have no idea what they're doing or where to learn. Fortunately, Billy had some connections. He knew of a famous drag performer in France named Barbette, and flew her to Hollywood to give the guys lessons. In reality, Barbette was the stage name of a young man named Vander Clyde Broadway, who'd grown up in rural Texas, then joined a circus and reinvented himself as a female aerial artist before settling in Europe. The avant-garde art world of Paris loved Barbette, but her attempts to teach Tony and Jack how to do drag were rocky. Tony took to the lessons right away.
You walked on the ball of your feet. You let your bottom sway from one side to the other, so it kicked your ass up in the air.
He'd actually picked up a few skills from other Hollywood performers.
And when your step goes to the left, your hip goes to the left. I learned that from Mae West.
But Jack had more difficulty. He felt his character should be clumsy, since he didn't have any experience doing drag. He was a lot less graceful than Tony. And after a few days, Barbette simply vanished. Turned out she'd given up in frustration and flew back to Paris. It didn't bode well. Early wardrobe tests were a little rough too. They went to a costume shop and found some used dresses from other movies. But the costumes weren't in great shape. Nothing fit right. They looked terrible. Marilyn's outfits, on the other hand, looked great. They were being designed by one of the top costumers in the world, an Australian designer named Ori Kelly, who was named after an 11th century king of the Isle of Man. Ori has an incredible life story that includes an on-again, off-again relationship with his Greenwich Village roommate, Cary Grant. We don't have time for that story here, but I'm posting bonus videos over on Patreon with all the details. That's at patreon.com/MattBaum. Anyway, Ori had a bunch of brilliant techniques for getting the most out of a costume. For example, in the seat of Marilyn's dress, he emphasized her curves by adding a hidden weighted string that pulled the material between her butt cheeks. When Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis saw how good Marilyn looked, they asked if he could do their costumes too. And that was a stroke of genius. Ori found they had excellent bodies for drag. At one point, after measuring Tony, he turned to Marilyn and said,
"You know, Marilyn, Tony's got a better looking ass than you."
And how did she respond?
She looked at him, opened the blouse, said he doesn't have tits like these.
What Ori Kelly came back with were some gorgeous 20s-inspired dresses that blew everyone away. Jack and Tony had found their look.
When Jack came out, he was like a 20-cent tart. So I came out like Grace Kelly or my mother. Very, always meticulous.
As that was going on, they also needed to figure out their makeup. Tony and Jack went through hours of makeup tests. After a while, they realized they were starting to look unsettlingly familiar.
I realized more and more that I was getting to look like a bad imitation of my mother.
But the makeup, they realized, was helping them find their characters.
I would purse my lips because my lips looked too straight, so as soon as I would stop, and that was the female in me. Jack, it was the same thing.
Finally, they thought they were looking pretty good and decided to test it out. They dressed up in some gowns and headed into a studio lounge outside a women's restroom. They stood by a mirror and casually applied makeup while people walked by. Nobody gave them a second glance. As a heartthrob, Tony was used to turning heads, and he thought maybe they didn't look pretty enough. So they put on some more makeup and came back. This time, the moment they walked in,
girl walked by and said, "Hi, Tony."
Billy loved that. He said they'd found their look. Plausible enough to blend in if you didn't look close enough, but always just on the verge of getting found out. And not only did they look great individually, they looked great together.
From that first 2 seconds, I realized and Jack realized we had it made. That is to say, we knew we were going to blend with each other like two good musicians.
But doing makeup and wardrobe tests was one thing. Doing it on camera was going to be something else.
And it was nerve-wracking because that was a period of time where men in dresses didn't get guesses. You know, you just, we didn't talk about that stuff.
There was no turning back now. In summer of 1958, filming began. They got off to a great start, shooting scenes set in Roaring '20 Chicago. The film introduces our heroes, Jerry and Joe, two musicians desperate for work.
Anything today?
Nothing.
Thank you. Anything today?
Nothing.
Thank you.
Times are tough, and there's only one lead, a band that's about to head to Florida, but they're not likely to be hired.
You gotta be under 25.
We could pass for that.
You gotta be blonde.
We could dye our hair.
And you gotta be girls.
We could...
No, we couldn't.
As they're trying to scrape some work together, Jerry and Joe happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they witness a mob hit. The gangsters, led by a fearsome boss named Spats, recognize them.
We didn't see anything, did we?
What? No, nothing. No.
See?
And besides, it's none of our business if you guys want to bump each other off. We don't...
They slip away for the time being, but every gangster in Chicago's looking for them. Desperate, they can only think of one way to skip town.
I understand you're looking for a couple of girl musicians.
It's a fast-paced, goofy opening that all leads up to the big reveal at the end of Act 1, when they show up to meet the band at the train station in full drag. All that makeup work, the costuming, the lessons in how to walk, all culminates in the moment they finally appear.
I feel like everybody's staring at me.
With those legs, are you crazy? Now, come on.
It wasn't the first time drag had appeared on screen, but it was one of the most prominent and prolonged drag roles in decades. Audiences were sure to be surprised, especially with jokes that were quite daring.
It is so drafty. They must be catching cold all the time, huh?
Will you quit stalling? We're gonna miss the train.
And suggestive.
How do they walk in these things, huh? How do they keep their balance?
Must be the way the weight is distributed. Now, come on.
There's only one thing that could top this entrance, and that's Marilyn. Her first appearance makes a big impression.
Look how she moves. That's just like Jell-O on springs.
She looks fantastic. Even the other actors on the set couldn't help but stare.
She was outrageous, just outrageous.
But after shooting it once, Marilyn wasn't satisfied. According to Tony, she said, "I'm just walking, that's no entrance." And after she went to her dressing room, they could hear her shouting at someone, "I'm not going back to the fucking film unless he reshoots my entrance. Nobody should be looking at Tony Curtis playing Joan Crawford. They should be looking at me." Billy promised her they'd redo it, and he and Iz stayed up through the night trying to come up with something more eye-catching. The next morning, he had Marilyn redo the entrance, with the train rigged up so that when she walked by, Marilyn was delighted. It was basically the movie slapping her on the ass. And if she was happy, that meant they could move on. At this point in the film, the big question is, are these guys going to get away with this? And so far, so good. They introduced themselves.
We're the new girls.
Brand new.
My name is Josephine.
I'm Daphne.
Mm-hmm.
They talked their way past the band leader, Sweet Sue.
Where did you girls play before?
We spent 3 years at the Sheboygan Conservatory of Music.
On board, they fit right in with the other musicians.
I have the most divine seamstress. Comes in just once a month. Oh, my dear, she is so inexpensive.
Come on,
and she
Daphne.
told, oh, all right.
And by the way, 2 cameos to watch for in this band. One is Joni Hannon on drums. She ran a lesbian bar in LA in the 1950s with help from her gay brother.
The day shift was all gay girls, and the night shift, it just did a switch like they do in England when changing of the guard. All the boys came in. It was one of the most popular gay bars in the valley.
And the other is Grace Lee Whitney, who would appear in another iconic project just a few years later.
Is that a girl?
That's a girl.
As the train gets underway to Florida, Tony and Jack's characters, Josephine and Daphne, meet Marilyn's character, Sugar, a singer in the band.
I come from this musical family. My mother is a piano teacher, my father was a conductor.
Where did he conduct?
On the Baltimore and Ohio.
Joe starts to fall for her, though of course he can't reveal his true identity. The scenes on the train were a lot of fun to shoot.
I show up almost every day, whether I worked or not. I just enjoyed hanging out with him, you know?
The performances were great, the jokes landed, everyone was having a blast.
So the one-legged jockey said, "Don't worry about me, baby. I ride side saddle."
Even when the actors were crammed into a berth for hours on end.
We were so tight because there were like 13 of us in that small space. I tell you, when I'd get out of that, because we were there 6 hours sometimes, I could hardly walk.
They were having a ball. Even Billy was enjoying himself, occasionally ruining takes because he kept laughing at the performances.
You know, like kids in a candy shop, you know? Because we knew it was all there for us. We just had to pluck this. Because whatever you touched, whatever you said, it was funny.
Yeah.
There was one problem looming over them. They didn't have an ending for the film. Billy and Iz liked to write and revise as they went, and they had a rough idea for the ending, but no dialogue. But they had weeks to go till they wrapped. They figured they'd think of something. Meanwhile, an even bigger problem was brewing. And that problem was Marilyn. She was giving a great performance. But off camera, she was a bundle of nerves. She was constantly late to set, sometimes by hours. And when she did arrive, she said she got lost on her way, even though she'd been shooting films on that soundstage for years.
It was a mental thing. She emotionally was unable to face the cameras until she felt like it.
Another problem was her acting coach, Paula Strasberg, who constantly hovered around the set with a black umbrella. People on set called her the Bat. Marilyn knew she needed to deliver a winning performance, and she'd look to Paula for approval after every take. It was getting so that she wouldn't even listen to Billy.
Finally, we did another take, and this time, Billy Wilder said, "Cut." He turned around and looked at Paula. He says, "How was that for you, Paula?" Well, Paula almost fainted in the chair, and that was the end of that trouble for Billy Wilder.
Marilyn was also having trouble with her lines. Take after take after take, she kept forgetting what to say. At one point, Billy offered to write the dialogue on a card and stick it to the set.
Ich will das nicht lesen, ich möchte also da, wenn ich das lese, werden die nächsten Sätze nicht. Sag, ja, aber das kommst du herein, nicht wahr, und du hast noch einen Satz zu sagen.
Why was she having so many problems? Well, a couple of reasons. One was that there was a lot riding on this picture. A chance to prove herself as a serious actress and to manage her own career without a studio head doing it for her. And things weren't going well in her personal life. She'd recently married playwright Arthur Miller, but things weren't going great between them, especially now that she was spending so much time around her old friend Tony. And then there's something that isn't always acknowledged about Marilyn. She had long suffered from endometriosis, a chronic disease that can cause intense pain and complications with pregnancy. In addition to her career pressure, Marilyn also desperately wanted to be a mother. In New York, she would sometimes visit playgrounds and hang out with moms to help them look after their own kids. Her friend said if she could have chosen between acting and motherhood, she'd have chosen motherhood. She and Miller were trying to conceive, but in the last 2 years, she'd had a miscarriage and then a non-viable ectopic pregnancy that could have killed her. At this point, she was taking painkillers and sleeping pills, which helped keep the pain under control, but also made it hard to get up in the morning and concentrate during the day. So that, on top of the stress of the shoot, was making things very difficult for her. Things got even tougher when the production moved down to San Diego, standing in for Florida. At that point in the film, the heroes have arrived at a resort hotel with a band, but they can't drop their disguises yet. There's a nationwide manhunt for them, plus they're broke. And then there's Joe's burgeoning romance with Sugar, which he doesn't want to leave behind.
What are you talking about? Me and
You
Sugar?
and Sugar.
We're just like sisters.
Well, I'm your fairy godmother, and I'm gonna keep an eye on you.
But that's not the only romance. As soon as they arrive, a rich divorcee named Osgood takes a shine to Jack Lemmon's character Daphne.
If there's one thing I admire, it's a girl with a shapely ankle.
Me too. Bye-bye.
They make some small talk about playing bullfiddle in the band.
Do you use a bow or do you just pluck it?
Most of the time, I slap it.
And Osgood likes what he sees.
You must be quite a girl.
Want to bet?
After he gets away, Daphne, which is to say Jerry, which is to say Jack Lemmon, starts to appreciate just how different life is for women.
What happened?
I just got pinched in the elevator.
Well, now you know how the other half lives.
Look at that, I'm not even pretty.
Meanwhile, the actors were starting to get a little more used to being in drag all day. At one point, Tony Curtis was getting impatient with how difficult it was to use the bathroom in his full getup, so he came up with a solution based on something he'd seen pilots do in the Army.
Where the pilots used to have a little funnel that was in their trouser with a little tube going down, so they never had to go to the bathroom. So I rigged one like that.
Unfortunately, in San Diego, Marilyn's difficulties started getting worse. Sometimes she'd deliver her lines perfectly, but other times she just couldn't get a sentence out. For example, this shot, which is only a few seconds long, took 80 takes. 80.
It's me, Sugar.
Another shot called for her to say one line, "Where's that bourbon?" She kept forgetting it. Billy taped cards in the dresser with the line written on them, but on the next take, she went to the wrong dresser. Finally, she got the line, although with her back to the camera, it looks like it might have been dubbed in afterwards.
Where's that bourbon?
As shooting went on, Marilyn was getting more and more tense. She would frequently call for her assistant to give her a thermos of coffee, but everyone around her could smell it wasn't coffee. She was just drinking vermouth. A dangerous combination with the barbiturates that she was taking. But as difficult as it was, she was determined to keep going. She and everyone else knew that once she got the lines out, the material was fantastic.
She knew where the joke was. She was not a dilettante. She was born with that kind of gift. Because, you can have 50 actresses. They may have been all quite good, but nobody would have been better than her.
And to Sugar, she is genuinely captivating. Once they settle in at the hotel, the Joe character longs to get to know her more intimately. So when nobody's looking, he changes out of girl drag and gets into wealthy businessman drag in order to engineer a meeting with Sugar.
Cheerio.
He plays the role of a rich yacht owner, and sure enough, Sugar's intrigued.
Haven't I seen you somewhere before?
Not very likely.
And he hints that he's the rich heir to an oil company.
You collect shells?
Yes, so did my father and my grandfather. You might say we had a passion for shells. That's why we named the oil company after it.
For her part, Sugar accidentally indicates that they're a good match when she lies and pretends to be rich as well.
Oh, well, I guess some like it hard. I personally prefer classical music.
Oh, I do too. As a matter of fact, I spent 3 years at the Sheboygan Conservatory of Music.
Good school.
And then things get a little dicey when Daphne shows up and realizes what's going on.
No! What is it, young lady? What are you staring at? This happens to me all the time in public.
Tony's accent here is a little unusual.
I could have played my own voice, but I said I wanted to do something a little unique. I had this kind of half-assed Cary Grant, "Hello, my darling, I do believe I've got a pebble in my left boot."
He'd actually developed this Cary Grant impression years earlier when he was in the Army. His outfit only had one movie to watch, Gunga Din, starring Cary Grant. They'd play it with no soundtrack, and Tony would talk along with the movie, filling in dialogue as Cary.
When the picture was over, Billy Wilder showed it to Cary Grant, and Cary Grant said, "I don't talk like that."
Anyway, sparks start to fly between Sugar and the rich oil baron.
Ahoy there!
And sparks were flying behind the scenes, too. The entire cast stayed at the hotel during filming, and according to Tony Curtis, one day during a scene, Marilyn leaned in and whispered to him that he should come see her in her room that night. He did. They talked about the film for a while, and then Tony wrote things got intimate. He slipped back to his room just before sunrise, so nobody would suspect anything. But there would be repercussions to come. As shooting continued, Marilyn's ability to work deteriorated. She was distracted, forgetful, and that was when she was even able to make it to set. Finally, one morning she was found in her room semi-conscious. She'd overdosed on pills and was rushed to a hospital. Word got back to set. She was going to need time to detox. And as concerned as everyone was for Marilyn's health, the production was also staring down a harsh reality.
I would guess the picture was $750,000 or so, or more over budget.
They didn't have the bottomless resources of a studio to save them.
We just had to keep our fingers crossed that the movie-going public would bail us out.
The show had to go on, but how could it without the star? As difficult as it was to contemplate, the producers started to wonder if maybe it was time to replace Marilyn. For the time being, they did their best to shoot around her absence. In a side story, Osgood, the lonely divorcee, continues to flirt with Daphne, Jack Lemmon's character. They go out dancing, and Daphne has to go along with it or risk blowing her cover.
Daphne, you're leading again.
Sorry.
They hit it off. And the next morning,
I'm engaged. Congratulations. Who's the lucky girl? I am.
This is one of the best scenes in the film. It's got some great one-liners.
What are you talking about? You can't marry Osgood. You think he's too old for me?
And it veers surprisingly close to acknowledging the existence of same-sex romance.
But you're not a girl, you're a guy. And why would a guy want to marry a guy? Security.
Everyone was thrilled with how these scenes came out. It made it easy to forget they still hadn't written an ending. And then they got some more good news. Marilyn was doing better and ready to return. When she got back, it was time to shoot some particularly steamy scenes. Tony's character, Joe, is still posing as a wealthy oilman. He arranges a date with Sugar on Osgood's yacht, and they get down to some flirting. That's when Sugar makes her move.
Don't fight it. Relax.
The lighting here is a little dark, in part because they had to be careful not to show too much. Ori Kelly designed Marilyn's dresses with pads to cover her nipples, but she sometimes took the pads out because she didn't like how they felt. The darkness also obscures something going on between Marilyn and Tony during this scene.
I had that kissing scene with her. She was naughty. She'd fall on me and grind me, not only with her mouth, but a few other places. And she'd wait until I got aroused. Then she'd get up off me. It was fun. I can't think of it as anything less than that, you know?
But the warm feelings between them didn't last long. In one of the shots they had to film, Tony's character is supposed to hand Marilyn some champagne. Marilyn wasn't taking it, so Tony pushed at her a little roughly. She pushed it away, also getting rough. Marilyn's husband, Arthur Miller, happened to be on set that day, and he charged in to push Tony away. A shoving match ensued, and Billy had to separate them all and send them to their dressing rooms to cool down. After a while, Tony went to find Marilyn and Arthur and apologize. But when he found Marilyn and Arthur in her dressing room, the mood was even more tense than he expected. And this account of what happens next comes from Tony's book. He wrote that he started to apologize for losing his temper, and then Arthur Miller interrupted and told Tony he should also apologize for sleeping with his wife. Tony was stunned. Marilyn had told Arthur about their night together. Tony wrote that at that moment, it was hard for him to breathe. Marilyn wouldn't look at him. Arthur was in a fury and threatening to beat him up. And that's when Marilyn stepped in and said there was more. She was pregnant, and she believed the baby was Tony's. There was a long pause. Arthur jumped in and insisted it couldn't be. Marilyn started to cry. Tony managed to stammer, "What do you want me to do?" And Arthur would only say, "Finish the film and stay out of our lives." And that's where they left it. Billy sent everyone home for the rest of the day. The next day, Marilyn called in sick. And then the day after that, she was back on set to resume filming. But tensions were through the roof. And there's no account of them saying anything else to each other about the pregnancy. By that point, there wasn't much more to shoot. There were some shots of everyone running down hallways, a few reaction shots, Marilyn delivering an emotional speech on the phone, and if you look close, you can see she's reading her lines off a blackboard just off camera. In the film, the story culminates with the gangsters finding our heroes at the hotel. The guys manage to duck them, but they know they've got to get out of there. Tony's character, still posing as an oil millionaire, tries to break up gently with Sugar. He tells her that for tax purposes, his people found him another oil heiress that he has to marry.
What is she like?
According to our tax advisor, she's only so-so.
And although Sugar tries to act like it's no big deal, you can see a really, genuinely heartfelt performance here. This was the kind of emotional depth that Marilyn had always looked for in her roles.
We'll anchor us away and have a bon voyage. If you need an orchestra to play at your wedding, we'll be through here in a couple of weeks.
But after ending it with her, Joe can't bear to leave Sugar behind. He runs back and gives her one last kiss, which to all the other characters would have looked like a lesbian kiss right out in the open, a pretty shocking sight for the time.
Josephine!
Sugar is stunned, but then she recognizes the kiss and she goes after him. There's a mad chase with all the gangsters. The gangsters who could recognize the guys wind up dead, shot by other gangsters.
There was something in that cake that didn't agree with him.
And then it's Osgood to the rescue, whisking them away in his boat. Sugar and Joe descend into an embrace in a shot that conceals that Marilyn didn't show up to set that day. Tony's actually embracing a stand-in. All that's left is for Osgood to plan his marriage to Jack Lemmon's character. Daphne tries to let him down easy.
Yeah, Osgood, I can't get married in your mother's dress. She and I, we are not built the same way.
We can have it altered.
Yeah, no you don't.
With that, filming was done. But their troubles were far from over. Now Billy had to present the film to the Production Code Administration. The PCA usually reviewed scripts prior to shooting, and if they approved, issued a certificate. Without a certificate, theaters typically wouldn't show a film. But the PCA hadn't seen a script for Some Like It Hot since so much of it was written as they went. Now, the PCA watched a rough cut in February of 1959, and they cataloged a range of objections. In a letter, PCA head Jeffrey Sherlock noted all the dangers associated with a story of this type that could be enormously objectionable. And not just the drag. PCA notes also called out the bootlegging, gambling, violence, and unsympathetic portrayal of Italians. And Sherlock wasn't the only one with concerns. A religious group called the National Legion of Decency wrote a furious letter to the PCA, calling the film seriously offensive to Christian and traditional standards of morality and decency. An official from the Legion of Decency, Thomas Little, said the film's transvestism and clear inferences to homosexuality and lesbianism were outright smut. He added, the offense in costuming was obvious. The Legion of Decency said it was morally objectionable for all audiences. Following their lead, several state and local censor boards banned the film or limited it to adults only. In short, conservatives wanted the movie to be as restricted as possible. They hated it.
It stinks.
But to everyone's surprise, Sherlock had the PCA grant the certificate. The material he wrote in a letter to the Legion of Decency is handled properly, although he acknowledged he wasn't sure if the public would agree. He also added a note at the end that Marilyn's dresses were, of course, indefensible. So maybe the Legion of Decency might have gotten their way if only they'd complained more about Marilyn's dresses than Tony and Jack's. As it was, the film squeaked through with PCA approval. But there were other problems ahead. For one thing, there was still a lot of tension behind the scenes, especially between Tony and Marilyn. Tony was at a screening of some footage and saw that Billy was only using the shots where Marilyn looked her best, usually after dozens of takes, and where Tony tended to look a little exhausted. He was miffed about that, and when the lights came up, some crew member asked him, "Hey Tony, what was it like kissing Marilyn Monroe?" And that's when he said something he probably shouldn't have.
As he was standing up, he said, "It's like kissing Hitler." Well, Jesus.
Now, in the years that followed, Tony has claimed he never said that.
I never said it.
But other people heard it.
Tony Curtis stood up and made this famous remark of just like kissing Hitler.
And Tony also said maybe he did say it.
If I said it, and I probably did.
And that he definitely did say it, but he meant it as a joke.
The joke was so obvious.
It was particularly unfortunate because Paula Strasberg, aka The Bat, Marilyn's acting coach, was in the room at the time.
There was a silence in the room and a deep intake of breath from Paula Strasberg. They were all scared. They were scared that Paula would go and tell Marilyn.
But if Paula said anything, Marilyn never acknowledged it. She had bigger problems after filming Wrapped. She'd started to experience complications with the pregnancy, and soon she got some terrible news. As had happened before, her pregnancy was ectopic, that is, non-viable. It had to be ended before it caused life-threatening harm to her. Marilyn was heartbroken. She was furious with Billy, blaming him and lashing out, though it was likely a result of her endometriosis and nobody's fault. In any case, Dealing with the uncertainty about her health, the future of her career, and her relationships with her husband Arthur and her ex Tony made this time unbearably stressful for Marilyn. Meanwhile, there was more bad news about the film when the Mirisch Company held a test screening for an audience in well-to-do Pacific Palisades. The audience didn't know what to expect, just that they were about to see what had been described to them as a major motion picture. How'd it go?
It was the worst reaction of any film I have ever been in.
As the film unspooled, people in the audience started walking out, furious.
Mothers and fathers were just taking their children by their hand about 10 or 15 minutes into the film and marching out of the theater.
Part of the problem might have been that they thought they were going to see a prestigious drama.
It was a disaster. The audience had come to see suddenly last summer, and they never laughed.
Whatever the cause, only one person in the audience laughed. Not dissimilar from my own experience being the only person who laughed at a screening, I'm afraid this is true, of Master of Disguise.
Am I not turtly enough for the Turtle Club?
But as Billy pointed out,
one sporadic laughter, and then nothing for 5 minutes, it is worse than no laughter at all.
After the lights came up, Billy went out into the audience to see who that one laughing guy was. It turned out to be Steve Allen, the comedian who created The Tonight Show. Out of an audience of hundreds of people, he was the only one who had a good time. In any case, it seemed clear they'd made a flop that could not only ruin the Mirisch Company, but also everyone's efforts to strike out on their own without the studios.
And all of the Mirisches, the various Miri, were gathered around him, and all of them were saying, Billy, you've got to cut 15 minutes out of this film, or we can't even release it.
So Billy made some changes, but not the ones anyone asked for. A week later, Jack Lemmon heard that they were doing another test screening.
I said, gee, what did you cut? And he said, 60 seconds. I said, what? He said, that's it. If they don't like it, that's too bad for them.
They didn't change the film, but they did change the audience. For the second screening, they went to Westwood, where they'd get a younger crowd from UCLA, and they set up that it was a comedy, this time with joke signs outside the theater boasting that they were about to show a minor motion picture. Now, with a younger audience primed for something funny.
That preview in Westwood was the best preview of any film I've ever been in. They screamed.
When he heard how well it went, the comedian Steve Allen had a message for everyone at that first test screening.
I told you so, dummies.
One of the biggest laughs of the movie was the last line that they'd originally put in as a placeholder. Jack Lemmon's character is trying to explain to Osgood why they can't get married.
I smoke all the time. I don't care.
Osgood doesn't seem to get it.
I can never have children. We can adopt some.
And finally, Jack's character comes clean.
I'm a man. Well, nobody's perfect.
That brought the house down. As a last line, it was, in fact, perfect. Encouraged by that second screening, the movie distributor, United Artists, gave the film a huge media blitz. They sent cutouts of the cast to theaters, with instructions to position them lounging on couches. They ran newspaper ads saying, "For a good time, call your local theater," with ushers answering and posing as Jack Lemmon. And they released a sexy trailer that starts with a few frames that don't actually appear in the film, showing Marilyn in one of those revealing dresses, now fully lit. The film got its New York opening at Loew's Capitol Theater on March 29, 1959. Marilyn made a glitzy appearance, and despite all the personal trouble she was dealing with, she was determined to give the public a good show. Photos from the opening show her beaming at the crowd, police holding fans back. You can see just how much the public adored her. The film got glowing reviews. It expanded to more theaters. It was the top film in the industry for weeks. And then a month later, it returned to the #1 spot again. It went on to get 6 Oscar nominations and a win for Ori Kelly.
I thank you, and particularly Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon. They never look lovelier.
In other words, an Oscar for designing drag, something that wouldn't happen again until 1994 with Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. The success of the film gave a big boost to everyone's careers. Jack went on to work with Billy Wilder for years after that. Tony went on to appear in more huge pictures, like Spartacus, where he had an even gayer role that was cut from the film but restored years later. I'll have more about that over on Patreon. Marilyn won particular acclaim. Here was proof she could deliver a complex, nuanced performance, both funny and heart-wrenching. She even mended fences, to an extent, with Billy. They were later seen hugging. He told reporters they were friends now, and said for all the trouble of working together, they even were thinking about collaborating again. But they wouldn't get that chance. Just a few years later, in 1962, one of Marilyn's doctors found her unresponsive in her bedroom. Another overdose. This time, it was too late. Marilyn's death shocked the world. In the aftermath, There was an outpouring of love and tributes. Hundreds of people lined the streets outside her funeral, where mourners heard Judy Garland singing Over the Rainbow. Marilyn was memorialized as one of the greatest film actresses of her time. And she's never been forgotten. She lives on today as an icon of Hollywood's golden age, as an actress who was loved by her fans as much as she loved them, and who was missed by everyone who knew her. And although we mostly remember Marilyn for her roles on screen, she also left a big impact on the business of filmmaking. When she defied Darryl Zanuck and started her own company, she sent a signal to the world that the old studio system was over. She used her star power to help lead the way for everyone else in the industry to take more control of their work and their careers. Her company and her work on this film helped make that change possible. And over the next decade, independent actors, directors, and production companies flourished. Billy went on to direct big successes like The Apartment, and to collaborate on other films like Ocean's 11. And the Mirishes went on to produce some incredibly iconic films. West Side Story, Fiddler on the Roof, The Great Escape, The Pink Panther, In the Heat of the Night, The Children's Hour, The Magnificent Seven. Groundbreaking films, many of which probably never had a chance of getting made in the old studio system. The success of Some Like It Hot, and other independent films around the same time, helped prove that actors, directors, and indie film companies could be successful without the Harry Cohns and Darryl Zanucks of the world. And it showed that film censors were out of touch, that their condemnation didn't mean anything to a public that wanted more of the fun that they'd been missing out on for years. Sure enough, Some Like It Hot was part of a wave of films that pushed the boundaries of the PCA rules, particularly when it came to gender and sexuality. In quick succession, audiences got films like Suddenly Last Summer, starring gay actor Montgomery Clift playing a doctor who uncovers a terrible secret. Psycho, with Anthony Perkins in a gender-bending role. The Pawnbroker, with Brock Peters playing a gay gangster. And foreign films about queer life like Victim, Taste of Honey, and Leather Boys. Audiences flocked to these daring movies, and each one pushed the door open a little wider for what came next.
The film is revolutionary. I think that's absolutely true. Because you must remember that 1950s was very conservative, politically and sexually. But things, they were a-changing, and this film was part of that change.
As those films rose, the PCA declined. Studios started releasing films without certificates, refusing to make changes. By the late 60s, the PCA was dissolved. Jeffrey Sherlock retired. One of his last acts in office was helping the MPAA move to an early version of the ratings that we use today, like rated G and rated R, with a few modifications over the years, like adding PG-13 after nobody could agree on a rating for Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. The ratings still aren't a perfect system, but the production code was far worse, a pass-fail with no room for nuance. The new system, ushered in by movies like Some Like It Hot, gave filmmakers lots more latitude to explore controversial stories. And like Marilyn, in the decade since its release, Some Like It Hot has achieved an iconic status. It's been recognized by the American Film Institute as the best comedy film ever made, similar honors from the British Film Institute, the Writers Guild, the National Film Registry, and more.
There is certainly no moment, meaning no particular film, if it could ever mean more to me, or that was more important to me, professionally, but emotionally.
And its story still isn't over. Some Like It Hot has recently been reborn as a Broadway musical that opened in 2022. This new version is set around the same time, but with some big changes. This time, after dressing as a woman to escape from the mob, the Daphne character realizes this feels right, that they're non-binary. They found the life they didn't even know they were looking for.
Ladies, I was set for bed until I saw this shade of red. I may be good, but honey, I ain't dead. Let's be back.
And no spoilers, but there's more to Osgood in this version as well.
Chemistry has certain rules that they don't teach in Sunday schools. Care to pool our molecules?
Beyond being a delightful story, the musical won multiple Tonys, including Best Leading Actor for J. Harrison Ghee as Daphne, the first openly non-binary actor to win a Tony.
For every trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming human who ever was told you couldn't be seen, this is for you.
It's a fitting distinction that the film's legacy continues, breaking new ground, telling stories of people who'd previously been overlooked.
As we say in the show, some like it hot, and that ain't bad.
From its earliest versions a century ago, to Billy's bold vision, to the modern musical, it's a story that's become much more than just a silly comedy. It's a film that's helped reshape entertainment and push the bounds of what everyone thought was possible.
I'm so thrilled that I'm in that movie, and that I do a good job in it. That meant a lot to me.
And it's a reminder that nobody needs to be perfect to deserve love.
I always feel that I work for the ones who work hard, and they go to the box office and put down their money and they want to be entertained, or I always feel I do it for them. When the camera starts until it stops, That moment I want to be perfect. As perfect as I can make it.
Now, there's lots more to say about Some Like It Hot, like how Barbette left home at 14 to join a circus and became the world's most famous drag queen trapeze act, and Ori Kelly's incredible career dressing women and undressing men, and how Some Like It Hot drew talent from underground lesbian bars of the 1950s. I'll be posting bonus videos about all those stories over on Patreon. Big thanks to everybody who helped me with research, especially the folks in the Arts, Recreation, and Literature Department at the Seattle Public Library, the Margaret Herrick Library at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and all the patrons who helped me track down footage for this video. Now, if you'll excuse me, Tony promised to show me a good time.
I shall give you one of my French suppositories.